You're not old enough to say groovy.
Hey everybody, it's Kelly Nielsen, the Grief Guru, and on this channel we talk about all things related to grief. What is it? What does it look like? What does it feel like? But most importantly, we share tips, tools, and resources on how to navigate through grief and get back to living a life that you love. And on today's episode, we're going to be exploring the correlation of addiction and grief, and then specifically what role does faith and faith communities play in our healing from grief. I'm thrilled and delighted to have Pastor Ed Treat with me today, and he is the founder of the Addiction and Faith Conference, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, and he has really dedicated his career in exploring how these things are connected and to really equipping the body of Christ and the church community to be a solution for those people that are dealing with grief and or addiction, and really exploring how those things are related. So Ed, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation and really appreciate the work you're doing. I don't know of anybody that's doing more effective work with grief than what I've seen of your work. So.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And unfortunately, there's a huge demand, right? Like, unfortunately, there are not enough practical, applicable tools that are in the hands of the people who really need it. And we know, that these are problems that compound if they go unaddressed. And so, for the sake of our viewers, if you would, share just your experience with grief and how that you saw that kind of shaping things you experienced later in life for a little bit of context.
Yeah. So, so it's tied to my, it's tied to my faith journey quite a bit, the grief part of my life experience. So I grew up in a big family, 6 boys and 2 girls. When I was about 12 years old, my older sister, who was 19, we were a Catholic family. We went to church every week. Dad, required it, and we marched in like ducklings behind mom and dad. And we were always late, And so when I was younger, my older sister, went off to with a group of kids and fell in with a church that was more evangelical, and they were a little more spirited than the Catholics were, and so they were. Their expression of faith was a lot more exuberant, I guess. Anyway, so she fell in with that group. We thought she was nuts, this Jesus freak, Anyway, so she and a bunch of the folks from her church went up to the mountain sledding one week, and this was in the Pacific Northwest. And at the end of the day, they were sledding down a very steep hill, and my sister hit a tree, and it killed her instantly. Her boyfriend was filming, and the sheriff's department estimated her impact at about 60 miles an hour. So she anyway, so I always think about those poor kids coming back on that long bus ride back when one of their members, was dead.
Right.
It's pretty heavy, but I know for me and my family, it was absolutely devastating. And I know that we didn't deal with it. We just kind of moved on. But I do know that my family began to fall apart after that. And that was about the time I started using alcohol, cigarettes, I didn't really connect it to that, but that was probably the most formative experience of my life to that point. And it was a point in my life where I began to ask the big questions about, God? Where's my sister now? What does this mean? And I went looking for what she had found, because I thought maybe she found something important, but I couldn't quite experience it the way she had. I tried. It just didn't fit. So I gravitated back with the kids, and I spent the next 12 or 14 years just partying my life away. I pretty much just kind of ran my life into the ground. Age 27, I got into treatment and I started my recovery process. And it was about 3 years into my recovery from addiction that I did a workshop with a man called John Hughes, and he did what's called family sculpting. And you'd spend a weekend with a group of people, and he would take each of us one at a time, and he would take members of the group to represent members of our family, and we would do a family sculpture. And so he would talk to you first about your family. What were the dynamics? What position of birth were you? And then he would ask you to pick out your family, and you would go through the room and pick out people to play your brothers and sisters, your mom and dad. And then he would make a human sculpture out of these people, and he would position them in a ways that represented how they were in my life. And what was stunning was the power, emotional power of that. I watched other people doing it thinking, oh, wow, that's powerful, but it probably won't. I don't think it'll affect me. Man, did it affect me. When it affected me was when I walked up to the person playing my dead sister.
Wow.
And he says, what do you want to say to her? And I just started bawling. It was such deep grief. And he was, I think even the instructor was a little afraid of how much grief was there. I mean, it's like, I've been holding that inside for, 14 years. And I think a lot of that was driving my addiction.
Wow.
That unresolved grief. And so that blew me away. I remember part of my brain going, wow, this is, that's what is going on here. What is all of this? It was just enormous. And I had no idea.
So my question is, first of all, I come across so many people that is their experience, that they have this unresolved grief that they're so distant from that they don't even realize it's still there. And that just points to, I think, our lack of processing and mourning well, as a culture in the church. Like, we tend to just move through and move on and want to be okay. And there's a lot of people walking around with this buried trauma and this buried grief that they've never dealt with, and it's affecting their lives in all these just horrific ways. My question to you, hearing that story, is, so what did you do after you unearthed this like mountain of grief? What did you do to process through it and be able to move beyond it?
I'm not even sure that I did anything intentional, except continue to do stuff for my recovery, go to 12-step meetings, and I've done a lot of therapy and a lot of counseling over the years. And I can't say that I really, it may still be unresolved in me, and I don't even know that. So I do know I'm able to talk about it now without, getting all choked up, or, I think that was that experience was a huge step forward. But I can't say that I really did much beyond that, except deal with the rest of my issues, because I had other issues and have other issues growing up in a really dysfunctional, that continues to be part of how I have to manage my life. It was a very traumatic family that I grew up in, besides
right. So tell me about.
I want to go back to what you just said about how it's not recognized, and I think there's a cultural issue here that we don't do grief well in the culture, because my experience was after that, a couple times I started crying right after my sister died. I started crying in front of my friends once in a while. It would just hit me, and I would cry, and it was really uncomfortable for them, and they just really wanted me to stop doing that. They just didn't know what to do with it, and so it was just a matter of suck it up or stuff it. And now, having been a pastor for 25 years and walked through the grief process with countless people, people are really reluctant to express their grief.
Right.
I know back in I was struck by a professor once who talked about how they did grief in the ancient days, and he was referencing some biblical scene, I think, when Lazarus died, I think. But in those days, when somebody died, they knew how important it was to get your grief out, to express it. That they knew that when someone died, people who were professional grievers, wailers, would come and gather around, and they would get people crying by wailing, crying and acting out grief, and that gave everybody permission to grieve. And I thought, man, imagine if we were able to do that. That would have saved me a lot of years of misery.
Right. Yeah, it really, in my opinion, it really is the difference between grieving and mourning, right? And grief is this internal process that can actually stay stuck and make you sick. Like, the biblical definition for grief is a sickness in your body, right? But mourning is the external expression of that. And we don't mourn. As a culture in our country, we don't mourn. And I wrote down what you said, suck it up or stuff it. I think those are the two choices we're left with. And especially the more time that goes on, I find that even in my own experience, it's like the longer time goes, people go back to their life and they kind of don't want to hear about it. And so especially if you haven't found the help or tools to deal with it and you're still just really struggling with it, you have less and less support for having an outlet to talk about it and really, move through the mourning process. So it really is, it's a huge need in our culture. It's a big gaping hole that we're just not addressing.
Yep. Yeah, it's hard to imagine all the unresolved grief that's out there in people and impacting their lives in such a powerful way. I had it described to me as though that grief was like holding a beach ball underwater, and trying to hold it under that, all that grief and emotion, holding it down for all those years.
Right.
Finally allowed to come up.
Right. And
the longer you hold it, the scarier it gets, because you think if it comes up, it's going to kill you. It's just so
right.
That pressure. Yeah, exactly. And so people do, what you did, or a lot of people do, they dive into other things to distract or numb or whatever it is. And so I want to hear about your transition into becoming a pastor and what your experience has been like as a pastor of a church with both of these things, addiction and grief. What has that been like for you?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. So the question is about with addiction. Oh, yes. So a lot of the process of recovering from addiction is grieving. There's so many things to grieve. It isn't just the loss of my sister. I've lost her since then. But it's also like for addicts, for people in recovery, there's a loss of all those years. And that's a huge loss. It's a big deal. You lost. I'm watching my kids have a life that I never had. They're going off to college and doing the things normal, healthy children do that I didn't do. I wasted through all those years. And so you come to realize how much you've lost. And of course there's all the money and the health and all of that, and missed opportunities. So just amazing how many things in life that that are losses, that are things that we grieve over, that we carry with us. And I think for me, the process of being in recovery in a 12-step program has taught me, that I have to talk about these things, or else they become things that I'll have to resolve later.
Yeah.
We think, and that's the big lies. We think if we can just get past it and just wait it out, that it'll go away, but it doesn't. It actually grows in power and becomes difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, talk to me a little bit about your organization and even recognizing the need for an organization like that, and maybe a little bit about how you see the role of the church as part of the solution. What is their role? What are they responsible to do, and are they doing it?
Yes. Well, I love that question, because that's sort of my passion. Is I got into recovery. I was in recovery for 5 years and decided to go to seminary, thinking that would be a place where I could deepen my relationship with God and grow spiritually, and that it somehow would be therapeutic as well. And was deeply disappointed when I got there to find out that it's mostly an academic setting, and that none of those things happen. So I've had to pursue those things on my own. And then also to find out with great disappointment as a pastor for 25 years is the church is not a place where people get to talk about their grief. If you have a loss, the church is also a place that kind of tells people, get over it. Everybody's losing loved ones. I lost loved ones. Let's move on. And so that they become part of the problem of denying it. Denying the issue of grief and the need to resolve it. And the same with addiction. I mean, I know people turn to the church for help with grief, and they turn to the church for help with addiction. And very few churches are resourced for that. Churches that I've served over the years will have a community grief group they'll recommend you to go to. And I think I've heard you talk about this too, but really those people seem to just sort of sit in that grief. There's no professionals there. There's no process there. It's just a place to go and talk about how sad you are.
Right.
There's no real way to move through it. It's just really it kind of leaves them stuck. And so I have yet to see the church provide any resource. That's why I said your approach to grief is the only one I've ever seen that actually moves people through it. in a way that they get past it rather than sitting in it. And,
Right.
and it's the true, and the same thing with my organization with addiction is churches are a place that people turn to when they're struggling with addiction and with other mental health issues. And the church is really not equipped for it. I mean,
Yeah.
pastors aren't trained for any of this.
Right.
It's just a smattering of training, and it's it's such a big part of life
Right.
that to send spiritual leaders out without even core competencies in grief and loss, but also in addiction and what it does to families and to communities, feels like you're sending people out without the tools to understand human nature.
Right.
And so that's kind of the mission of our organization, is to say, wait a minute, Jesus cared about broken people, and
Right.
the church says it cares about broken people, but doesn't really. And not that the church doesn't care, but they don't know what to do with it, so they don't deal with it. And
Right.
so that to me feels just like, well, then that means the church has become irrelevant, because if they admit it's a problem and they know it's a problem, but don't do anything about it,
Right.
what's their role really? I mean, and if it isn't to do the kinds of things Jesus did to help people through difficulties, then
Right. Right.
yeah.
And I feel for
the church, because I feel like, and you alluded to it, I feel like in the church you kind of fall into one of two camps, right? Either you can get the people who even say, oh, they're in a better place and they're in heaven, and you're a Christian and you should never be sad and you should never have troubles, and the peace that surpasses all understanding should just guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. And so we should just, and which just encourages the suck it up or stuff it mentality, right? Or they create a shared space, like you said, for folks to come and mourn, but without any help or process to move through that. And so people just stay perpetually stuck. But I really feel for pastors, because even if pastors weren't equipped to have some training and know how to deal with it, they have a flock of, however many, let's say a couple hundred people, and someone passes away this week and they offer support to the family, but they really can't dedicate the time to walk someone through all, because the next week or 2 weeks later someone else is dying. And so they kind of have to be the frontline EMT, but what we need is a comprehensive, systematic way of reaching people and walking people through. And so that's what I just really hope to provide, because I feel for the pastors, and then I feel for the people who raise their hand and want to help, but they don't, they don't really have, they don't know the tools in order to be able to help. Because, man, I don't want to ever be doom and gloom, but we are grieving, in such epic proportions between COVID and suicide and overdose and all the deaths that are happening. And if people don't get in touch with and process through their grief, I don't want to think about where we'll be at a year to 5 years from now. If all these people are trying to keep the balloon underwater, it's just gonna be awful. And so I know that for both of us, our passion is getting tools that work into the hands of church leaders and pastors, and multiplying, getting it to the people that need it the most. So to that end, tell me about, and tell our viewers about, this awesome conference that you're putting together, who it's for, and what's going to be shared.
Yeah, so the Center of Addiction and Faith our mission is to awaken faith communities to address addiction. And I honestly believe that almost all of addiction, addiction is complicated, and I don't want to be overly general with it, but after 25 years as a pastor, 35 years as a recovering person, I'm convinced that most of addiction has underlying issues, mental health, but a whole lot of that is grief, unresolved grief. And so when people get well, the chances of them relapsing are they're really high. They're unfortunately high. And that's because we never get people to that next place of, what were you medicating from? What were you taking it, using, what were you numbing? And so there needs to be some more work done to kind of mine that out. And if it's grief, then we need to be able to help people deal with the grief. Or if it's addiction, or if it's depression, usually it's some kind of trauma, and the loss of loved ones, and it can all tie back to grief, essentially, because with every trauma there's a loss. I mean,
Right.
Something, innocence or something like that. And so we're trying to get churches engaged with all of that to say, if we're going to really be Jesus in the world, we need to do the things. We need to not just say God loves you, but we need to demonstrate it
Right.
um, with compassion and care and the tools. And so
Hmm.
there are things faith communities can do, and there's some are doing it. But I think the first thing is for them to understand what they're dealing with, because I'm not sure that the awareness is out there like it should be. I don't think people real. I think there's still a lot of false understanding about what addiction is. I think there's still a lot of stigma around that, and I
Hmm.
think there's still a lot of fear around grief and how to deal with
Hmm.
it. People are afraid of it. People are afraid of it, and because they're afraid of it, it tells you that that fear has got to be based in unresolved grief. I mean, if you're afraid of
Hmm.
grief, it's because you're afraid of what you're carrying inside, right?
Hmm.
And so society has a way of saying the things we're afraid of, we're going to hide instead of deal with. And so people like you become prophets to say, no, let's talk about this. And then everybody goes,
Right.
like you say, no, we have to because God said we
Yeah.
have to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then people's lives get saved. The image on our website is the picture is a man with his arms raised. He's got chains hanging off. It's the picture of the demoniac who Jesus healed, who had many, it said he had many demons. And Jesus cast those out, and the man was made well. So I don't know what his issue was. Could have been chemical dependency. It could have been depression, bipolar. Who knows what his diagnosis? But he had problems, and
Hmm.
Jesus made him well. And he wanted to follow Jesus, and Jesus says, "No, I want you to go tell everybody what God has done for you."
Right.
And for so many people that are recovering from grief or addiction, telling that story is part of their healing and helping others heal
Yeah.
themselves. And so people like you are the ones who help, the stories and the continuing to raise the question is releasing spiritual power into the world to address the hurts of the world, which is because the dark side, the dark force wants to keep all of that stuff secret, not dealt with. And
Yeah.
the challenge is to continue to force people to go places they don't want to go.
Yeah. Absolutely. So who's the target audience, or who would be the perfect person to come to the conference that you're hosting? Is it who are the folks that would most benefit?
So we say clergy and other faith leaders, and that is anybody who takes an interest in helping other people. I mean, if you love people and want to help people through difficulties, then that makes you a faith leader, in my view. And so it's anyone that's interested in learning more about the issue of addiction and and understanding it better and knowing how to respond to it. Um, I know my life personally was saved by somebody who learned about addiction and learned how to deal with me. It was my mom. And
Mm.
she got educated by my brother who went off to treatment. He came back, explained it all to my mom. She went, "Oh my gosh, all my kids have this." She
Mm.
went to Al-Anon, she went to school, and she got an education. She began to confront me. And so I honestly believe it takes a codependent, somebody who loves an addict, to save an addict. Addicts can't save
Mm.
themselves. They can't save
Mm.
themselves because they don't think they have a problem. And so
Mm.
it takes somebody who loves them to do something. So if you have somebody you love who's struggling with addiction, you should come to this conference, because then you'll learn how to handle, how to help save their lives.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people dying from addiction.
Yeah. 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 Unfortunately, those numbers just keep going up. And this is in person or virtual as well, right? So people can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in person is, there's nothing like being gathered together. We were going to try and postpone it because of the COVID issues, but they look like they're leveling off. But we're taking extra safety precautions. But we're also allowing people to come for whatever they can want to contribute. Just a small donation or a big donation or whatever. There's no price tag on the virtual participation. And so that virtual attendance will get you into the conference, and you'll see all the main speakers. We have 4 really great speakers. We have some worship that we'll be doing online, and we have some storytellers who will talk about their journey. And so those are all virtually available through
That's
Facebook.
awesome. That's awesome.
Well, we will include the links to the registration below, and we'll blast this out so that people can come and just be a part of the conversation. I think honestly, there's so much power in just having the conversation and facilitating a conference that is solely focused on talking about these things and talking about where we're falling short and comparing notes and providing resources. Like it's a tremendous thing. And so I know I'm honored and privileged to be able to be a part of it and contribute and talk about the grief piece of it and see what we can't do to improve things on that level. But yeah, I just appreciate everything that you're doing. I appreciate you having the conversation, and even if people are uncomfortable, just facing that uncomfortable space so that we can do better.
Yeah. Well, and the mission of our organization is not really to produce content. Our job is to raise awareness. So our job is to be a prophetic voice to say, you need to do better to the
Yeah.
church. And then the church says, well, like what? What do we do?
Right.
I say, well, you need to go see Kelly.
Right.
And so I know there's people doing amazing work out there, and I don't need to replicate that, but I do want people to know about it. So
Right.
So our job is to direct people to you and get the healing that they need.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be a part of the conversation. We will do what we can to get as many people at the table so that we can all share notes and just go back out there to be solutions and resources in our communities, because it is addiction, overdose, death is on all sides these days, and people are looking for answers. And actually, depending on the light that you look at it, people that aren't in the church are looking for the answers as well. So if we, the church, can have solutions that work, we're going to be attracting people to come and find real help. So yeah.
And too often the answer the church gives is, you just believe in Jesus and that's good enough. And it was like, well, that was fine, but I believed in Jesus all through my using years. And in fact, I went to my first AA meeting thinking, well, this is good for these people, but I have Jesus, so I don't need this.
Right.
I know.
Right.
Religion can become part of your denial, and it's like, well, as though the name Jesus were a magic trick of some kind,
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, no, it isn't just about believing in Jesus. It's about believing in Jesus and submitting to trusting.
Yeah.
And to being part of community and, giving your life over to a new way of being. And so,
Yeah.
there's some steps that follow, and the church doesn't really talk about that too much.
Yeah.
And submitting to a process. And our God is a God of order. God could have just snapped and have the world come together, but he chose to do it in a methodical fashion, day after day, light and dark. That's how he is. He does things with order, and he can instantaneously and spontaneously heal people of things. But more often than not, it's through process and it's through order, and even as we were talking, I was just thinking about the story of Lazarus, and that when Jesus came and he was met with Martha, he wept with her. Even though he knew what he was going to do, he was the solution. He still did not minimize or negate her feelings, and he entered in with her in that place of sorrow and had a moment of sorrow. And that's what we're called to do. But then he went and was the solution. That's what it is, to enter with people where they are and then show them a solution, a path to healing, and I think
the church sometimes can skip over that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thankful to turn out.
Some of that's on us as human beings, because we come to God and say, save me, God. And then God says, okay, gets me to a meeting. And then my response is, yeah, save me, but not like this. It's like,
right.
We want to dictate the terms of how we're going to be saved.
Right.
Well, I, for one, I'm super excited. I'll be up there in Minnesota. So for folks that may want to come in person, it is in Bloomington, Minnesota. It's not too cold there yet. That's what I'm banking on. The weather is still decent. It's fall weather, yes. Yes.
It's the prettiest time of the year to be in Minnesota. It's absolutely gorgeous. The trees are turning. The pictures are really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping to it's always 2 weeks, right? There's like 2 weeks of gorgeous fall. I'm hoping to catch a piece of it anyways. But well, thanks so much, Ed, for all that you do. And we will see you in a couple of weeks at the conference.
All right. Thanks.
All right. See ya.